This is going to be such a great conference talk. I'm so excited. Our guest is Mr. Ty Harper, producer, radio aficionado, savant, podcast producer. I'm excited to hear from you. And also our moderator, Dr. Francesca D'Amico Cuthbert, a big supporter of this program. We're so appreciative of all of her knowledge and her time and commitment to hip hop education. The doctor is in the house. I'm so pleased that you're here with us. So without further ado, we'll start this talk. Take it away, Mitu.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the third session of Voices of Revolution, day one of Hart House's Humanz of Hip Hop, a two-day virtual conference meant to highlight the relationship between hip hop culture and the world that we live in. My name is Francesca, and I currently serve as the Community Engaged Early Career Fellow at the Jackman Humanities Institute here at the University of Toronto. And today I will serve as moderator for our third session titled A Work in Progress, which, as has already been mentioned, will feature our featured speaker, Ty Harper. Ty is a radio producer and documentarian who has been covering Toronto's hip hop and R&B scenes for well over a decade. First as co-host and co-creator of OTA Live on Flow 93.5 FM, and later as co-founder of cityonmyback.com. He currently serves as a producer on CBC Radio's Q, hosted by Tom Power. And just this past summer, Ty also hosted and co-produced the CBC's This Is Not a Drake podcast, a 5-part limited run podcast series that used seminal moments in Toronto rapper Drake's career to explore the history and evolution of hip hop, R&B, and Black culture. I'd like to welcome you today to the talk, Ty, and thank you so much for taking the time to join us and share with us what will be your personal and professional story as it has intersected with hip hop. So I want to begin by asking you about the origin point. How did you initially become involved in hip hop culture?
I mean, I think that's always an interesting question, because to me, as a Black person, hip hop culture is just a part of my culture, like my food, like my traditions, etc. So I think, unlike many, I guess, non-Black diehard hip hop fans, hip hop was less a discovery and more a passing along of my cultural heritage without me actively thinking about it until much later in my life. And so I don't really remember when I got involved in it. It was kind of always there, even though, obviously it wasn't. There was a moment where hip hop as we know it just wasn't being heard on the radio or whatever. But I think the moment that I became more active in my relationship with hip hop was probably when I returned to Toronto when I was 15, after living in Trinidad for about 8 years or so, and I started getting into DJing, and really, buying my own music. I think for a lot of us, when it comes to our relationship with music and hip hop, it's that moment where you actually begin to purchase your own stuff, that you really begin to self-determine as a hip hop fan or a music lover, because now you're actually making these decisions about what you're going to buy. And then you're forced to think, as money's kind of, short, like, why are you going to buy this? I remember spending an entire year saving up to buy a Jodeci cassette, because it was like, I don't know, like a gazillion dollars, because it was imported HMV. And it really forces you to think about, like, well, why do you really want this? And I think that allowed me to really start to think about why I wanted to buy this record. And then it began to really, and I mentioned Trinidad, because, and we'll probably get into this, but there's a way in which I appreciated hip hop back then. And I think that really changed when I moved back to Toronto. And so when I started to buy vinyl and buy hip hop, I think that's when I really started to think about, why am I buying this record? And what does it mean to like this song? What does it mean to like this artist? And then more importantly, where does all this fit into who I am as a Black Toronto kid? engaging with hip hop within my city and within obviously the broader hip hop community.
Great. So you mentioned a little bit about coming, coming from Trinidad back to Toronto, and just thinking about the multiplicities of your, what made Thai in terms of an identity. So can you tell us a little bit more about how, at least you think now as a grown person, hip hop helped shape and to some extent determine the nuances and the intersections of your own personal identity?
I think early on, again, because I grew up in Trinidad and was surrounded by a Black majority population that was self-determining itself daily, hip hop for me, compared to what it means to me now back in Toronto, was really just entertainment. I was into Heavy D and Slick Rick and Dougie Fresh the Show was the first song I remember being captivated by so much that I had to write it down and learn the lyrics. But it was really just party rap. And it's because when you're living in a place where you are the majority, racism, these issues are kind of things that you understand within the context of history, maybe like the past, not to say that it didn't exist. Obviously, being a country, Trinidad, that was, kind of almost a 50-50 split between Black and Indo-Caribbean people, there was definitely racism, but it definitely wasn't something that we thought about a whole lot. And so for hip hop, my point is that back then it was more a party thing. And then when we moved back to Toronto and the realities of racism just obviously hit me day one back here, then I began to understand where hip hop could be a space to think about who I am in this North American space that is historically an oppressive space for Black and racialized people. And it became a completely different thing. And, I could compare and contrast, like my cousin used to send me tapes of like KRS-One and like Public Enemy. And I remember specifically even living in Trinidad, there was a party that we had, and one of the older kids came into the party and kind of crashed it and played like Public Enemy. It could have been like Rebel Without a Pause or something. And I just remember us being like, why are you so angry, dude? What's wrong? But moving back to Trinidad, that totally made sense. And I was like, oh, okay. And so I think hip hop was definitely there to shape how I thought about myself. And as where I considered home shifted, my relationship with hip hop shifted. And I would argue that it became even more intimately a part of how I thought about myself and negotiated how I exist in this space when I moved back to Toronto.
And so as you kind of began to transition between, relating to hip hop on a more a personal level, right, as thinking about your identity, can you tell us a little bit about how, when you started to think about your professional interests, what you wanted your professional trajectory to look like, how did hip hop help inform the choices that you were making professionally? So take us through, your professional history of being with OTA Live and everywhere since that you've been in relation to hip hop.
Right. I think I had, and I'm going to use this term because a good friend and person that I respect and look up to, Ian Kamau, he said, he was on Facebook and he just, I think when the podcast came out, he posted something that was really sweet and inspiring about the podcast, and sort of like reflecting back on what he knew me for. And he said that something to the effect of like, I've always had this one singular motivation. And I think that is so true, because I never really had interests in any other thing except for being a producer. I know it's strange, and I don't know that's necessarily a lot of Black people in Toronto that just want to be producers. You know, you might want to be a radio host, you might want to be a musician or an artist. But producer, I don't think that that's something that people really think about. And I think that a lot of that has to do with just what we see placed in front of us as far as like our understanding of radio and television. And, you know, I don't think those behind the scenes types of jobs are things that we normally are able to imagine, because first off, they aren't something that you see. And also because we don't necessarily know a lot of people within our communities who have done those particular types of jobs. Maybe television, but I don't think radio as a producer, particularly in the private space where that's just not an option. You're not going to be automatically guaranteed a job as a producer at a private radio company. So yeah, for me, like the first time I was forced to think about a career was, and I've told the story a million times, is the petitions that Milestone Radio was first sort of bringing to the community in their, you know, now historically an historic 12-year bid to have a station which would become Flow 93.5, and someone knocking on my door. And, you know, at that point, I think my dad had been asking me, you know, and anyone who knows Caribbean people, like, or Caribbean parents, like, what you're going to do with your life is, and I think with like any group, like it's always a conversation. And, you know, my dad, you know, was definitely, you know, asking those questions. And I was, I don't know, 16, 17. And I remember that knock on the door and someone with a pamphlet or a petition to sign for Milestone Radio. And it just immediately hit me like, I want to be a part of that. And I think later on I realized, you know, you could come up with creating programs and shows. And that was definitely what I wanted to do. And part of it was probably maybe because I was kind of dabbling with DJing at the time, and I liked the idea of playing with sound. And, you know, I'm part of a crew to this day called SoundQuest, and our mixtapes are where we kind of got our credibility within the hip hop community. And you know, if you were to listen to I did the sort of R&B / hip hop mixtapes. And if you listen to my mixtapes were always very much these compartmentalized things where like I put a lot of thought into song selection and flow and skits and messaging. And that's literally what I do to this day working as a producer. And so that is what I always wanted to do. And I went to Seneca College, and, you know, paralleling my decision to go to Seneca College was flows again, Mr. Jolly and the whole like circle of Black business leaders who were involved in that mission to bring a station to Toronto were in the background, because as I'm going to school, I'm hoping that once I get out, I'm going to get a job there, or I'm going to apply. And, you know, if you know the story of Flow, there was like, I guess 3 chances where they tried and they failed, or 2. And then I think it was the 3rd time. I mean, I guess I should know this because I just finished doing a documentary on this, but, you know, in that time when that's happening, I'm at Seneca, you know, I'm seeing greats like Mastermind who had just come out of there. I think Big C had been there as well too. I could be wrong. G Wonder was also up there as well too. Lots of people, Cam, Static, you know, like, so I'm in there, and I remember, I think it was the year I was going to graduate. And I think this was also the same year that the CBC lost, you know, ironically or coincidentally, however you want to look at it, to the CBC, which is actually where I work now. And they lost that 2nd bid. And I remember that happening. And I literally was like, okay, I don't need to graduate, because if I can't get a job at Flow, I'm not interested in working in radio. Like I knew for sure I wasn't going to go work at CHFI. You know, I wasn't going to, like, those places I understood instinctively and innately that those places were not for me, unless I wanted to just get coffee and tell narratives that just were in no way interesting to me. And so I just dropped out of school, went back to DJing. And then obviously, as we know, Flow would finally get, the 3rd bid would get the station. And that was it. Words can't express how massive of a moment that was for me. I remember one of my uncles actually did the cabling at Flow. And so I think at that time I was working with him doing cabling, because at that time it's like, what am I going to do? I'm DJing and that's good, but need a job. And I was just doing this whole cable thing. And so one of the jobs he did was there. And I remember before Flow came on the air, he asked me if I wanted to go into the studio, into the station, and look at it. And I was like, oh man, that was like I was like, yes. And I remember walking in that place, and they had like these lights on the floor, just to, I don't know, like to light up the walkway. And I remember walking up there's like a sort of incline to go into the main studio, and just, it's like something out of a movie, man. I was like, fuck, this is amazing. And then I saw like, some of my peers finally get jobs there. And, I think I was more of a wait and see type of person still. I waited to see how things were going, and started to really contemplate what I wanted to do there. And, even there, like, producing was not a job option. They were hiring hosts, DJs. So I had to figure out, how was I going to get in here? I wanted to just be a producer, but I also realized that wasn't an option. So I was like, okay, I DJ. Let's put that on the resume. I remember doing a demo. Shout out to Mar Brown, DJ Agile. I recorded my very first demo, I think, at DJ Agile's home. It's horrible. And finally, I get a job at Flow as a board op. Shout outs to Baby U. I remember they put us all in this room. I think it was sort of an audition thing. It was me, Baby U, I think RG, and we had to like do some kind of like a talk segment, and I'm sure I was horrible then too. But it eventually ended up getting a position there, and also got to give a big shout out to Jemias DaCosta, who was also, I think, hugely influential in helping me get in there as well too. Became a board op. Had already been developing OTA Live as just a thing. Like, I think I still have the old pieces of paper where I'd written down like all these ideas for shows. OTA Live was one of them. I had another show idea called Big Tunes, and the host was supposed to be Dr. J. I mean, it was all these things. And I knew that these were really lofty goals, because, the way things were produced in there were really just straight ahead, talking heads, play music, back sell, front sell, which is obviously great. But I think what I wanted to do was a bit more complicated, and there weren't really a lot of people who understood what I wanted to do. And luckily, in comes Res Digital, who was, I think, already working there before me. And I don't know what it was that he might've said in passing. He was working at Team Flow, and he said something, and I was like, wait, are you interested in putting a show together? And he's like, yeah, like, dude. And, he'd already highly skilled editor, and had just come out of Ryerson, and had come out of broadcasting academically at a time where digital audio workstations like Nuendo hadn't existed in my time. And so I knew that I wanted to be an editor. I knew I wanted to be a producer, but wasn't equipped with how to do those things, because literally digital audio workstations did not exist in the late 90s when I was going to school. And so Rez had that. And he, gave me my first like sort of 101 on how to use Nuendo. And it literally, like, all it took was that one little thing, and I was off to the races. We came up together with OTA Live, and, we started to build that out. And I mean, I could go deeper, but, this is how OTA Live came to be, and sort of the rest was history. And here I am now working for our public broadcaster, doing literally the same things that I'd always wanted to do, and trying to champion our Black music, cultural history. And I'm really privileged to be able to do that right now.
Thank you for that. I'm sure the history of even just OTA Live is just so incredibly rich.
Yeah, and obviously building off an amazing, extremely rich history of Black radio and Black programming in this city, and so standing on the shoulders of amazing people like, you know, DJ X and Mastermind and John Bronsky, and obviously the godfather of it all, you know, Ron Nelson, you know, Norman Otis Richmond. I mean, it just so many people who have done amazing things and really inspired me to want to do what I do right now.
Absolutely. And so as you were moving forward in your professional career, can you tell us a little bit about what your engagement with Toronto hip hop, obviously personally, but also professionally, helped you learn specifically about Black communities in Toronto, but even taking it more broadly across Canada?
Again, it was just part and parcel to who I was. And because I wanted to be a producer, I obviously wanted to play our hip hop from Toronto, not even from Canada, you know, and obviously there's, you know, a rich history across Canada as far as Black music, Black culture, and particularly hip hop goes. But I'm like, I'm not thinking about that. I'm thinking about like the fact that, you know, mathematic, you know, was, you know, 2 grades below me at Mother Teresa, and a prolific B-boy, like, you know, and was making amazing music. You know, I think Learn to Earn was the song I picked for this Humanz of Hip Hop, my soundtrack. And yeah, I mean, picture being like, I don't know, I was probably 19 or 20, and I'm mouthing the words to a song of a kid that's like 2 years younger than me and should be like someone that looks up to me. And I was like, you know, so being exposed to that, knowing that there's this rich history here in the city, and being around like the artists that you know came out of Scarborough, like Monolith, and you know, seeing guys like Lindo and Danny O on Electric Circus, and you know, like Bass Poet, you know, Went to Buy a Milk, and like obviously that intersecting with me being a DJ and being serviced all these Socrates. I mean, seeing a guy like him on the 85 Shepherd East bus with, I guess his partner at the time, who was also in his video, and then like seeing them on the bus and being like, you know, I always say that'd be equivalent to seeing Q-Tip with Bonita Applebum, you know, like, so all this history is around me. And as a radio person, I'm like, how is it that I'm not seeing it reflected in the programming? Obviously we had Michael Williams and Master T doing that beautifully for a decade. And then obviously Namagani, but you know, it still wasn't really being seen through radio, which I felt like was the vital sort of force, the daily sort of thing that you wanted to be exposed to. And so like, it just went without saying that if I was gonna be a part of some type of creation of programming on Flow, that it would have to automatically be tied to the music that was coming out of the city. Like it wasn't like something that I was like, it wasn't like an activist thing. It was just like, of course I'm gonna like wanna, you know, shine some light on all these artists. And that's what OT Alive always strove to be, a reflection of what hip hop was to us from a Toronto perspective. And so in being true to that, it would obviously play Jay-Z and Tribe Called Quest, and also, you know, R&B and D'Angelo and even like house and all that stuff. But it was also like really making sure that we paid homage to the music that was coming out in that moment, which was like 2008, but also like respecting what came before us. And so, yeah, like it just informs everything. It just flows. It's like the force, man. It's the force.
I think for a lot of us that are familiar with OTA Live, I mean, one of the ways that I think of you, not just, you know, as a public broadcaster, but also as a storyteller. so many of the people that came through the program were really important to constructing a narrative of what has been and what was the time Toronto hip hop. So can you talk a little bit about, in your various roles in public broadcasting, how has your work as a storyteller helped you share the stories and the ideas that you think the public should know and perhaps has not known as a result of the way that the industry is structured?
I mean, again, it's the storytelling part was just, I mean, it just was what we were going to do. Even though, like, if you'd asked me, like, I wouldn't have considered myself a storyteller. Like, it was just, this is radio, and this is what radio is for. We're gonna play this music, and we're gonna talk to these people, and every year for Black History Month, we're gonna have one of our elders on, and we're gonna, why aren't we seeing more local stuff? Okay, well, there's Hip Hop Canada, this massive forum that has been a beacon of just greatness for Canadian hip hop and for Toronto hip hop. Well, let's try to build some kind of an initiative with them. It's called the Mega City Countdown. Let's start actually reaching out to artists and to get their songs. Let's start chasing them. Let's let them know that we're here. And then on a side, we started OTA Live the year that Chaos dropped Joyful Rebellion. Crucial. It was the first song we played on the show. And me and Kev went back a bit. I remember, I know I DJ'd for him once. I remember he had a gig at Spectrum and he needed a DJ, and so these guys were making this amazing music in the moment, and I finally learned how to edit audio, because it was the one missing piece that I just hadn't learned, and obviously inspired by what Rez was doing with our unauthorized biographies. And I was like, well, we need to start telling these stories about our local artists. And so while Rez would do the biographies and had a huge, he was basically the guy putting together our biographies. And we had, shout out to Ebony, shout out to, Dave, just a whole bunch of people, Nova, who were our writers and researchers. But the biographies was really Rez's thing, and I helped write as well too. But the local biographies that we did on local artists was me kind of being like, we can't just do hip hop south of the border as far as biographies. We have to find a special way to pay homage to the greats that have come out of our city. And so Chaos was one of the first ones I did, and then Socrates, and then Cardinal Official, and we didn't really get along to doing a lot more after that. But then Drake, ends up being someone that I get introduced to through my little cousin, who's actually managing him at the time. And the first thing I want to do is sit with him and talk, and we sat and we talked for must have been an hour and a half, and was probably one of the other biographies that we never ended up putting out. That is, I'm still sitting on that, it's hour and a half interview of me and Drake just talking back in 2008. It was sometime around his birthday. So it was late October. And it's a great interview. And hopefully one day I can, put that out. But that was what storytelling was for us. It was all those things. It was just doing what came naturally, which was just reflecting our community and our culture through this medium that was radio, which, if you weren't doing that, then what are you really doing,
Right. I want to ask one final question before we open it up to the audience members to ask questions as well. And this is more so a question that deals with the contemporary moment. In recent months, we've been having very important conversations across the globe, and specifically, in the context of what is happening over the summer in the United States, but especially questions and conversations about instances of anti-Blackness and systemic inequality in the music industry. And here I'm thinking very specifically of the introduction of the organization Advance just a few months ago. And also I'm thinking of a roundtable series on anti-Blackness that was put together by, I see he's joining us as an audience member, Ian Andre Espinay. And so I'm thinking of these two examples, for instance. And I'm interested to know from you, being someone that has worked in the industry and broadcasting, what do you think are some of the best strategies that we can use moving forward to address these particular issues in the culture industries as we start to kind of think about how to transform them?
I mean, that is the question, right? And I don't think any of us I mean, look, like, you know, the biggest issue obviously is the oppressive structure that we exist in, which is capitalism, and the ways in which it continues to oppress Black and Indigenous racialized people. And so, you know, I don't know that any of us as individuals or even as small groups have the ability to really handle that daily. But I think about an interview that I did with Jesse Wente. Well, I didn't do it, I produced it, and it was on Q maybe a month or so ago. And Jesse Wente, I believe, current chair of the Canada Arts Council, and we kind of talked to him, I guess, about this within the context of him as an Indigenous person who has now this power. And, you know, he talked about this idea of harm reduction. And so I feel like that is the practical space in which I could think about all this from, harm reduction. And so I believe the most obvious and practical thing that can be done as far as institutions within our sphere who implicitly and explicitly have this power to shape how we think about and value ourselves based on what they present to us through these powerful structures. You know, I think it's interesting because I don't think we realize that anything we know as far as culture, for the most part, you know, it's not like this thing that we just organically get. Like, it is through media. It's through these big, massive, powerful institutions that hit us with these visuals, these like audio, television, music, so radio, television, you know, the Spotify's, the iTunes, all of these places, and here, you know, nationally, the public broadcaster, the private broadcasters, however we receive media is how we understand what is valuable and what isn't valuable by what is not there. And so for me, I think the most practical and obvious way to do that and to affect how we begin to value ourselves as, I mean, as speaking for me personally as a Black person living in this space, in this territory, is I just need to see more of myself in the spaces that I work in. And I don't, and obviously, you know, you can say that if there's more of me, it doesn't necessarily mean that they have the same drive and goals as I do. But I think that's a given. I don't think any group of people in a space all are going to be driven by some sort of activism minded thing. That's not real. That doesn't exist. So, but I do know that when I first worked at the CBC and I was the only Black person on Q at the time, if I was to compare and contrast my mental health and how I felt in that early year, that first year, to how I am now when I'm surrounded by like more Black producers, more Indigenous and, you know, South Asian and Asian producers in that one little space, I can tell you that my mental health and my feeling of confidence around doing things for my idea of what matters when it comes to creating culture and content is vastly better. And so, you know, I appreciate like the talking and the research, and I feel like we have generations and generations of talking and research, and I think that we can still be doing that, but I think what we need to be doing is just hire more Black people, specifically from my perspective. Just hire us. Just it'll all work itself out, you know, because what we're really talking about is majority rules, and currently in these spaces, which are predominantly white, obviously the programming decisions are going to fall to what they want. But you start filling that out with more Black people, more Asian people, more South Asian people, you know, more obviously indigenous people. And you'll quickly see how that power dynamic shifts, regardless of whether those people as individuals are well-intentioned or not. It just does shift. And to me, that's the most practical thing that needs to happen. And when that happens, at least as far as harm reduction goes, I think you're gonna see, at least for the people, and there are lots of people, and I should also say that, like, you know, the CBC is a national, obviously, institution, but it's important for people to know that there are so many, you know, Black, Indigenous, Asian, South Asian producers and writers and hosts across that entire space who are daily fighting to see their idea of self and their idea of community reflected in that programming. And it may not seem that way, but I can tell you, it's almost like if anyone's seen Men in Black, you know, when they, you know, at the end of, I think, the first Men in Black film, when he opens that locker, and then you see like this massive universe where there's like all kinds of things happening that you just weren't aware of. That is just a sort of reflection of what it's like within the CBC when it comes to the BIPOC community of professionals inside there. And so the more people, the more racialized people that could be in there, I think, just from a very practical standpoint of what we could do today, we would see a significant shift in how, whether you're Black or brown or Asian or whatever, how that would change how you see yourself reflected, specifically in your public broadcaster. Private is a little different. I think it's just how you're going to convince an individual who owns a particular media corporation to change when it's their thing. I think the difference with a public broadcaster is we are the shareholders. It's our tax dollars that fund our public broadcasters. And so it's why I'm there now, because it is, for me, it's more likely that you can probably change things through your public broadcaster than a private one, because it is literally yours, even though you may not realize it.
Of course, and recognizing that we have to some extent power to hold them to task for those.
Exactly, it's you know, and in this moment, I think the CRTC is looking at massive changes to its policies. I think probably because of just like the way Netflix and all these larger companies are coming in, and so there's a push to have these companies just have to do more content that's rooted in the experiences of Canadians. But I think, you know, my point is that there are definitely bigger conversations, and it's easier, I think, to push our public broadcaster to better reflect our communities, particularly in Toronto, than it is to push a private broadcaster who really doesn't really have anything embedded in what it's supposed to do to change if it really doesn't want to.
Absolutely. I think now Bradley will help us turn over to audience questions if there are any people who would like to pose a question to Ty.
Absolutely. Thanks for that. I really appreciate it. It's such a good conversation, man. It's just, I get sucked in and I forget what time it is almost. So this first question comes from Lloyd, and it's a pretty straightforward one. For you, Ty, specifically in your work, how did you, can you explain to us what A&R did within the record company, like Artists and Repertoire, what that work was like for you throughout Toronto and how that maybe impacted your work being at the radio station?
Oh, well, I mean, I definitely was an A&R. I mean, A&R is a record label thing. I think the closest that you have to that within the framework of commercial radio is maybe a music programmer, which I wasn't either. Although I guess I was a music programmer within the context of OT Live. I mean, I was a music programmer, and I was program director, and I was the host, and I was the producer. We were all those things. As far as what that looked like within that context, yeah, it was just putting on the hat of a DJ, and I mean, it really wasn't that hard to just sort of use those instincts to keep your ears to the pulse of what was happening here in Toronto. I mean, because it's just so much like, particularly when OTA Live was on the air, like it was just so much amazing music that was happening, and it was just on us to really do what we were already doing, at least what I was already doing, which is like connecting with these artists, really getting a sense of what they needed, and trying to provide that as a radio show, whose job and part of our mandate was to do that in the first place. So I don't know if that answers your question, but
I think Lloyd jumped on the chat here. Lloyd, do you want to follow up with that and just kind of go from there?
Yeah, sorry. I mean, I guess you're right, because the A&R is a lot different than a radio station. You know, this talk specifically right now has really inspired me. You know, I've actually gotten in contact with the radio station manager of the CIUT station at U of T. You know, before the pandemic, I was trying to volunteer there a bit, and you know, now things are different, and so he actually got back to me and said they're going to have like a kind of a news show run by the students, only because we're all at home, it would be online now. But I mean, yeah, I suppose maybe my other two questions would be just like, I think, had you mentioned that there was also a radio station you didn't want to work at? Which one was that again? Specifically, it was like
it was every other
university?
station
Everyone.
in the entire like city. I mean, like for commercial radio, like I mean, Flow was the first Black-owned, like Black focus centered. I mean, I just think people, and obviously I don't know your experience, but I'm just saying from the perspective of if you're white and Canadian, I just don't think you can fathom what it's like to exist in a space where you're just not reflected. Like, I just don't think
I mean,
you can really understand what that means. And so like, if you want to get into a particular field, what it means to like, I didn't see myself reflected in radio before Flow. And so I just was not going to work at a place where I just knew instinctively that it wasn't really going to speak to what I needed. And yeah.
Yeah, I can relate to that sort of with my short experience at the radio station already, with in terms of some of their content is a bit dry, I suppose is a word you could use. But you know, they get a lot of funding from people who support them. It's just they have to play what their listeners want, I suppose, kind of a thing, right?
Yeah,
but
for sure.
They're definitely trying to push more to have like the students be making some executive decisions, it seems like, which is good because, you know, young people listen to music too.
For sure.
And,
Cool. Thanks for that, Lloyd. I appreciate the comment and the thought there too.
For sure.
We got a question from Zoe now. Zoe, do you want to jump on and ask?
Oh, sorry. Sure. So I just wanted to know about the title, because of course you have the title of your podcast, This Is Not a Drake Podcast, is kind of provocative in some way. And it's not actually about Drake, but in listening to it, I see that all roads kind of lead to Drake. It's kind of like the center point. And so I just wondered about like what your motivation of putting Drake in the title and putting not, and like how you sort of played with that. And...
Yeah, that's totally rooted in, again, like a natural activism. And if you listen to the actual prologue, it's fully explained, like the whole story of how that podcast came together. And, you know, it wasn't something that I was a part of. And so I was reached out to, I guess, initially just sort of like to get my thoughts on the actual idea of this thing. And like, this is I live, eat, breathe like local Toronto hip hop, like so many others and so many others before me. And so if you call me and tell me you're going to put together a podcast about Drake, I'm going to immediately have like something to say. And, you know, the CBC doing a podcast, like, let's be clear, this is the first time the CBC has ever done a hip hop podcast. And to me, like, it's fucking crazy. Like, how is it that 10 years into Drake's career, we still haven't had any type of programming within our public broadcaster that reflects how big Toronto and Black Toronto hip hop has been within the larger like global pop sphere. And so when they approached me, I was like immediately like, look, you're gonna do this podcast, and I can immediately flag the fact that if I was a Toronto artist or Toronto hip hop fan, and I heard that you guys, the CBC, was doing a podcast about Drake, and initially it was supposed to be about Drake, like his history, his backstory, and all that stuff, I was like, really? Like, that's who you're gonna focus on? Like, you've spent your entire legacy as a broadcaster completely like rejecting, erasing, oppressing the stories of hip hop coming out of this city in particular, and of course, just hip hop writ large. So the idea that you're finally going to do this because it's Drake, it's just going to look like a smack in the face to all of the great artists and histories that have come before Drake. So if you're going to do it, or, you know, I mean, there's a long story as to how I ended up doing it, but I knew that there was a push and pull between it still having to be about Drake. But I was like, okay, like maybe there's a way that we can do this that pulls people into the idea of Drake, but then very quickly uses this moment to explain why Drake, as great as he is just a reflection of the greatness of hip hop writ large, particularly here in Toronto and then south of the border. And that's basically what we did. And so this is not a Drake podcast is literally the fact that it is not a Drake podcast, but it is also a political statement that this is not about Drake. It's not about Drake. And rightfully so, as great as he is, it should not be about Drake until we make it about hip hop.
Right. Yeah, no, awesome. I'm just giving another plug to it. I posted it in the chat. I actually heard it accidentally listening to the current because I think that's where it was being aired or something. And I was like, what? Yes. What is this? And I was like, well, it was a total like mind screw, you know, whatever.
Yeah.
It's great, and it is, and Drake is part of it, obviously, because he's a continuum and a product of, you know. And you mentioned all kinds of people beforehand. Socrates, I dropped something in there about him doing the Raptor stuff, and you know, like there's a long line of really awesome people. Brad, are there any other questions? It's 4:24. I want to just have some closing remarks. There are other written ones. Yeah.
Yeah, I've got one more comment. It's actually a comment that was in chat that I've just kind of reached out and would like to share with everyone. It's from Daphne, and I'll just read it out for everyone. This is more of a comment than a question. I love how hip hop is often a way of resisting certain narratives about people or about people's experiences. For me, I have a lot of people in my life with preconceived ideas about who I am as a person because of my differences. But my poetry is a way of, quote, talking back in a healthy way. This kind of ties into Randall's question earlier about what others have in their lives they can use to create something out of nothing. And also what he said about how poetry, spoken word, hip hop can be an outlet for understanding and creating space for ourselves and others. Anyway, I guess what I'm trying to say is that I appreciate the focus throughout this conference on storytelling because it is so important. I enjoyed listening to everyone, and thank you for being here. Sorry for that was so long. I have 3 dogs here, so it's noisy and I can't turn on my mic. That is the end of the comment. And that was beautiful. And thank you for sharing that.
Thank you. Yeah. And shout out to, U of T. This is my my alma mater. I did my time at UTSC, and it's great to be back here virtually.
And when you say you did your time, you don't arduously, you just mean
oh well, I guess arduously. I came back as I guess a mature student, and so my mindset on that was a little different. I was there to get what I needed to get and get out, and I think it's a testament to the things that I really ended up appreciating, and the transformative things were really tied to like one course with Professor Francesco Villegas, who was at UTSC at the time, and he just totally changed my whole outlook around race and anti-Black racism and systems, and yeah, I mean, it was definitely massively influential. And of all the things I take away from UTSC, it was definitely that one course, and I still carry that way of thinking with me now. So I'm really appreciative of that time.
Yeah, I mean, we all have our favorite teachers, or that teacher that really impacted us, right? And I just saw in the chat that Ian was saying that his time was arduous with an LOL, but I hear you. Anyway, we do have to wrap up, and I really want to thank both you, Ty, and you, Francesca, as well as DJ Lene, DJ Craig, Dr. Audrey Hudson, and Lindsay Knight, aka Equal, as well as Randall for getting us started and setting the tone and doing such a beautiful talk that was really inspiring and powerful. All of our speakers, I mean, we have what we hope is a great little hip hop kind of community, which Francesca and DJ Craig have been part of last year when we first launched. So we thank you both for your support, and everybody for staying with us. I know it's been like a long day, but each session has been really interesting and had its own vibe.